Hello everyone, thanks for joining me today. Europe's common toad. It's common, right? It's right there in the name. But unfortunately, like around 40% of all amphibians, it is in decline. And the reason for this decline is not well understood. Today, I got a chance to speak to Rémi Martin, a scientist involved in a research project aiming to find out what these reasons are and hopefully to come with some solutions that may help prevent further declines in the future. This research project is funded by the Universities of Wolverhampton and Salford and by the Amphibian and Reptile Conservation Charity. If you'd like to know more about this project and other work by these institutions, then follow the links in the video description. So on to today's guest. Rémi started a Ph.D. at the University of Wolverhampton in 2019, focusing in understanding the decline of the common toad in the UK, using genetic, environmental and morphological information. His main interest is herpetology, the study of amphibians and reptiles, and he has previously worked in southern Mexico on the reproductive ecology of the American crocodile as a voluntary research assistant. So here's Rémi to tell us a little bit about this project.
So the project I'm doing started in March of this year, so basically it would be for the next 3 years. And so the aim of the project is to understand causes and consequences of common toads decline in the UK. This project itself is part of much global issue in conservation biology, in research, or in the field of what we call ecology, which is understanding the global crisis of biodiversity. And to introduce here the notion of biodiversity, it's something that many people they know this word. It appears in the media, in political speech and everything. So it's kind of it's a word, that biodiversity, that is used in everyday life of basically every citizen. But actually this notion is a bit more complicated than just counting species. So it's not just a list of species. Biodiversity is in fact something more complex, because it also takes into account diversity within ecosystems. So how the species richness, so how the different species can make ecosystem functioning efficiently, the diversity of the different ecosystem we have for the recycling of the different components, for the carbon, the cycle of water, for example. So it's kind of a very broad scale. You have obviously the different list of species. You have also within species, biodiversity means the genetic diversity within species, how the different population can maintain different genetic features that help them to still be able to evolve, for example. So
I suppose if you have a species that is in decline, for example, and its species level becomes so low, even though the species itself is not extinct, its genetic diversity is so poor that it's not going to be able to carry on. It's just eventually going to become extinct no matter what, because of the diversity.
Exactly. So it's exactly the point. So to be able to to maintain itself, to evolve in other species or anything. So that's part of a general evolutive process. To be able to maintain this evolutive process, yes, genetic diversity is part of biodiversity. So it's something that's a very small scale within species. So exactly, that's part of biodiversity. So you see that it's something actually a bit more integrative, a bit more complicated than just counting species. And this crisis of biodiversity is something that is very true since a few decades at the end of the past century. So now we are entering at the beginning of the 21st century, for example, scientists are now talking about a new geological era. So we are entering a new era, which is called Anthropocene, because precisely we are in a major biodiversity crisis. So we define geological eras by the fact that there is, at the beginning or the end, strong biodiversity crisis. So the last one was the extinction of the dinosaurs, for example. So at the end of the Cretaceous, and so that's the limit of this geological era. So now we are beginning a new era, since we are considering it at the sixth biodiversity crisis. And that's something very new with that. It's the first time that it's a living being, so a species, our species, which is responsible for this decline. All the other biodiversity crises in the past were mainly due to geological factors or natural events. The big particularity with this one is that we, a living species, is actually responsible for that. So that's something actually quite new to this. So basically, we are speaking about extinction. It's also a big field of research itself, studying the different processes of extinction. And for that, we have to identify which species are more likely to be entering this process. And there is several factors that can influence the fact that a species is likely to be extinct or not. You have the distribution range. For example, more a species widespread, obviously, compared to a species which is reduced to a very particular mountain range, for example. So it's less likely that one species with a wide distribution range would disappear than one species located in a very small space. Also, the body size. Big species are stronger tendency to be threatened. Dispersal ability, more species able to move far, can be actually colonizing new spot, changing its range to face. So if it's facing some problems, it can actually change. And in the case of amphibians, for example, these are animals who have a very low moving capacity, so dispersal ability. So if there is a problem in one area, they are not able to move very quickly, basically. Species that can't reproduce often or don't make a lot of offsprings, also, that's something. Reproduction rate is something that is a factor that affects the likelihood of being going extinct. And last, we can speak also about specialization, how all its requirements. So does it need a specific prey, for example, or does it need a very specific temperature range to be able to reproduce or to have its own biological activity? So the specialization within the ecosystem, for example, the place of the species within an ecosystem, it's also one of the factors that can influence its capacity to face extinction events, for example.
Yeah, so I guess if a particular organism is quite adaptable and could survive well in multiple different environments, then a catastrophic change to one environment might not necessarily cause it damage, because it could adapt to the new one, whereas a specialized organism is more susceptible to problems if its environment were to undergo some kind of change. If there was like a flood or something, and it could completely change the dynamics of its environment, and especially if coupled with something like what you were saying before about its dispersal range, if it's not able to escape very easily, then its particular habitat is going to be facing a bad time.
Actually, yes, that's yes, something that's also very important to explain the likelihood of one particular population or species to get extinct or not. Yes, and actually, the prediction of our species. So, yeah, the timing in which we can predict a species will be extinct is actually something very hard to do, very hard to predict. very small population are under the rule of what we call stochastic events. So it's just basically when it's very small, just random events can make this population just survive or get extinct very quickly. But it's something, stochastic effects are basically random effects. So it's something we can't really predict, and so that's something that doesn't help at all to understand and to actually face and act against the extinction of very small populations. And actually, when a population become very small, it enters also some kind of vicious circle in which we can call it a vortex of extinction. So you have factors responsible for the decline, and the smaller the population becomes, the stronger the factors will act to make it even smaller and everything. So driving it toward extinction, the vortex of extinction is kind of a vicious circle in which small population can't actually be saved. So what there is a level in which if you go under this size, this population size, well, basically you can't do anything. So it will go extinct anywhere, even if you have some measures to prevent it. Also, as part of the ecosystems, when removing one species, just one species going extinct, you can change the entire face of the ecosystem. So you can drive also other species later on toward this same process of extinction. So you have so basically to illustrate the fact that it's extinction is actually a very complex topic also to study, and it's something that makes every conservation measures on the field very difficult to carry on. So even though you can spend a lot of monies, a lot of effort, if you don't understand the complexity, or if we are not able to take into account the entire the complexity of all these factors, well, all these efforts can be for nothing actually. So that's something very, very important to take into account, and that's an important part of the basic research that can be done in biology, for example.
Okay.
And speaking more precisely about amphibians, we now have a good idea of the main causes of decline for the amphibians. So actually, why the amphibians? Why studying the amphibians? Basically, because on more than 8,000 species that are now described, new reports of biodiversity losses are basically telling us that there is an estimated 40% of all these species that have experienced recently a strong decline in populations. So it makes, at the moment, amphibians the group of vertebrates most threatened by extinction.
Wow.
That's basically, yes, even more than mammals that are very well known, or birds, amphibians are the vertebrates that are the most affected by this new biodiversity crisis. So the causes we can well, the causes we know at the moment for this, responsible for this, are mainly fragmentation and habitat destruction. Because of, obviously we know that the human population, world population is increasing. We have a lot of need for agriculture, for obviously urbanization is spreading, and all of this is making important habitat for animals in general and amphibians in particular very fragmented. It's a very small patch that are not connected with others. So basically animals like amphibians that can't move a lot don't are not able to move within patch. And because of their life cycle, so you know that big majority of species, they need ponds, water to reproduce, to spend a larval stage of life. And they also need an aquatic environment and a terrestrial environment for their adult life. So basically, when you are destructing just one part of the entire habitat, habitat, you already destroying the capacity of the population to maintain itself. Because just removing one part of something important, you are destroying everything for this particular species. So that's something that is very strong effect for amphibians. So obviously we're the dynamic of climate change also. So climate change affects amphibians by changing their physiology, so their internal parameters, how they can react to, for example, heat stress and everything. So it's also changing what we call in science the phenology, which is the timing of at which time they do the biological cycle. For example, reproduction, the date of reproduction is changed due to climate change. So habitat, even though the habitat, for example, is preserved, because of climate change, also we have the fact that a preserved habitat is not suitable anymore for this species. So climate change is also acting in this aspect. With climate change comes also the spread of pathogens, and the most famous one responsible for at least the decline of more than 500 species alone is the chytrid. So it's a very small fungus that modify the structure, the skin structure of the amphibians. Skin are extremely important organ for amphibians because it also regulates the loss of water, but their capacity to breathe also.
Mm.
So basically, by this pathogen, by affecting the skin, kills more or less quickly the amphibians, and it can have very dramatic effect, very strong and rapid effect on many populations that never faced this pathogen before. And thanks to climate change, it is now spreading even in temperate environments. So, for example, in Europe, although it was before recorded more in Mesoamerica or South America, so in tropical environments.
Yeah.
And so basically, the epicenter of population extinction and species extinction is in tropical environments, because it's also here we have the most important biodiversity. So basically, the biggest losses will be there. But it's now something that we can observe even in higher latitudes, like as I said, in Europe or in UK. Just to follow on these causes of decline, we also have pollution and chemical contamination. So yeah, it affects, for example, also the larval capacity of survival, and again, its physiology, so how it will regulate its vital function. So it can make, actually, it's not always lethal, but at the adult stage, it can make the animals being much less efficient in reproducing, so they won't reproduce as efficiently. And again, that can be one of the drivers toward population decline. In some cases, in very tropical areas, or with species that have very limited range, you have the over-exploitation of species. So basically, humans take animals in the field for example, mostly for amphibians for pet trade. So
Right.
some species, for example, of salamandra that are very nice, very good looking, can be very attractive. Uh, so actually, in these populations that are already very small, the simple fact of removing a few individuals, a few adults for pet trade can also have a dramatic effect in this peculiar situation. So it's not, obviously, it's not true for the vast majority of species, but in some cases, it's something that can explain also.
Okay.
You have, again, you have that comes with climate change. You have the invasion of new species, alien species that weren't in a particular place before, or that are introduced also because of mondialization, the globalization, sorry. So the trades between countries, you have new species that are arriving at places they weren't before, and it can overcompete the native species. It can hybridize with these species, so changing the genetic characteristics. So as I said, there is a very big list of factors that can explain population extinction, and maybe most importantly, and it's also the most difficult part to study, is something we call synergy. So the fact that all of these factors will interact with each other, making this even worse, obviously, because as I said, you have habitat fragmentation. Even though you have a good habitat, with climate change, the habitat is not suitable enough. Pathogen spreads with climate change. Species that in kind of stressful condition because of heat waves, for example, while they have immune response that are weaker to, for example, contaminants. So again, contaminants can have stronger effect in some kind of habitats or due to climate change. So the synergy actually, it's possibly the most important thing, but it's also the most difficult things to study.
No, I can imagine. I mean, you can take any one of those things you've listed and put them together with another one, and it just makes it so much more worse. I mean, I suppose, like taking for the pet trade, if they were to take a one that's infected with the chytrid fungus and introduce it into the pet trade, then because I guess the amphibians for the pet trade would be kept together in high population densities where you're waiting to be distributed, and then obviously that will then spread and that can affect the whole population. And yeah, so I can imagine it's a very, very difficult subject to study, because it's you can't just take one in isolation. You've got to see how they all work together, and I can definitely see how difficult it is to kind of predict how they're going to interact with each other and that sort of thing.
So actually, yes, that's the point. And even when we are studying is a fact, but when we are taking practical measures to save species, that's also something that can explain the fact that of all what we try to do, basically it's usually, mostly, it's sad, but it's like that, failures to save some population and species because of all of this complex interaction of factors.
What gets me quite a lot is you quite often hear about perhaps a brand new species has just been discovered, and almost instantly it gets put on the endangered list because they know that the habitat that it's in is in the process of being destroyed, and then they full well that it's, even though they've only just now realised it exists, it's already endangered.
Well, that's also part of, can explain also about the fact that we have better genetic understanding now, so we can make further differences between species that once were thought to be just one. So we had big range for one species, and actually now we are saying no, that's two different species. So you split also the distribution area. So when you have a new species discovered, well, you know that its distribution range is not big. So obviously it's already in this. You can classify it already as at least vulnerable or already threatened. Yes. And well, that's a very broad and hopefully yes understandable introduction about the different declines, causes of declines. And as I said, it's even though it's very located towards the tropic, it's something that we are now experiencing in Europe in many populations of amphibians that were thought to be before very common. And yeah, population are just collapsing and we don't know exactly why. So that's something that is already happening now. And that's why that's just justification basically of this project. So knowing what we already know about declining in amphibians, what are the causes in UK precisely that can explain decline of toads, and when we will be able to identify these causes, well, hopefully we'll be able to take measures and efficient measures to avoid any dramatic extinction of amphibians in the UK.
Okay, so it's a very sort of conservation based project. So you're looking for the reasons, and then you hopefully what you can be able to come up with some possible solutions or some measures that can be taken to kind of mitigate this.
Exactly. So it's the problem at the moment is that the common toad. So it's in the name. So it's common. So never really very deeply studied compared to, for example, the other species you can have in the UK, which is the natterjack toad, who is very located in some areas, and population dynamics are quite well known because it's a species that is already threatened in the UK.
Right.
Whereas common toad, we don't know why population are declining, which is the main factor, which are the different factors and how they will interact. So that's why I think this particular project is interesting, because we have this conservation issue to maintain this species. And there is also something I found personally very interesting, it's the basic research aspect. So this the evolutive signature of extinction in toads. So that's even in basic science, this is very interesting. And hopefully it will be helpful to take very concrete, pragmatic measures on the field. So maybe to explain what we're doing in this project, so I started beginning of March. So obviously I'm in the phase of seeing what's possible to do, what is not. So there is no, well, as I said at the beginning, there is no proper results to present, I'm afraid. But I can explain what we want to do and why we want to do this. So first of all, we have to gather genetic information of toads. So we basically want to sample population in the entire UK, so not only England, we have also Wales and Scotland. And we are basically trying to gather from living toads genetic information that is contained in the saliva. So we have swabs, and you take, like people that are doing DNA tests, for example, we are basically doing the same with toads.
Right.
So we have a little swab and we swab the mouth of the toad, so to have the few genetic information we can have from that, for example. Or from dead toads, on the roads when they are migrating, there is a big amount sometimes of squashed toads. So also we can, on dead animals, we can cut off toes. So actually it's tissue samples in this particular case.
Okay.
And part of this project, as we want to have good idea and a good coverage of the entire UK, we are trying to put citizen science project also. So we are asking people who are interested in participating in this project to gather genetic sample for us. Obviously, we are doing what we can, but toads are what we call explosive breeders. So actually, they are migrating in a very short time. So although we are in 1 month or 2 months all night on the field to gather sample, we won't be able in 1 year to have the entire coverage of the UK. So that's why interested people or people that already have knowledge and experience dealing with toads can help us to have genetic samples from swabs or toes of dead animals. So it's also a good way to raise citizen consciousness towards biodiversity declines. It's not because it shouldn't be just a problem of a few scientists that are wondering what's going on. That's actually, that's really something that it's a problem for the entire society, because it will have anyway repercussion for the entire society. So we are asking people interested, people who have this kind of sensitivity, towards wildlife in general. So that's also part of what you are doing, and we try to have this aspect also in our project. That is not only a question for scientists; it's also a question for anyone who is interested, basically.
Yeah.
So we need genetic information because not because it sounds cool to have genetic. It's a cool word to put in every kind of genetic, No, it's also very useful in the way to understand demography of population. So how population are doing? Are they declining? Are they in a good shape? We actually have what we can say genetic signature of the demographic status of a population.
Yeah.
So actually, it's not just a cool word that make you look a bit smart. No, it's actually something that is extremely powerful tool to understand demography.
Can I ask you something about the tissue sample? You say the toes of the toads. Is there a particular reason why? Is it just the toes? Is it just a good area to sample, or?
For example, it has been done by tradition. Actually, in some, we are not using these methods anymore. But for example, a few decades ago, scientists could cut toes, even of living toads, to have genetic information. That there is kind of that's something that has been done before. And also very interesting reason for that is if we are studying, for example, contamination or accumulation of heavy metals in the body parts of the animals. Actually, we know that toes are a place, the tissues around is a good place when we can actually measure the accumulation of contaminant in the body of the animal. So that's a good reason to cut toes precisely.
Yeah. Okay.
So yes, so about the fact that this genetic information will be useful because we can have a good idea of actually how the population are doing, and it's what we call the effective population size. Effective population size is how many individuals are participating in the maintenance of the population. So how many individuals actually are breeding. because you have a general toad population, you can just count them, but actually it's kind of a biased way to assess population viability, because actually what we know, it's a very, sometimes it can be a very small part of all these individuals that breed and make the population maintain itself. So basically, even though we have a lot of toads, maybe a majority of them are not useful for the population, let's say.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, obviously they compete for the right to mate, and not all of them are going to win those battles. So a lot of them will not get to mate in a particular season.
Exactly. So the fact that they are not able, individuals don't breed each year, for example. So it's kind of it's a better, more accurate way of assessing population stability is by measuring the amount of individuals that actually participating to the breeding efforts. So that it's not just counting individuals, and that's why genetic is important.
Okay.
Also, genetic gives us information about what are the threats they are facing. We expect that between patches, so places between ponds, for example, with toads will be breeding, individual can also cross these different patches and breed. So you have what we call genetic flux. So we can see if there is mixing between population. That's a good sign of population that are doing well. But population very isolated, that they are just breeding with themselves, there is the risk of interbreeding, for example. In breeding, basically, you can have the accumulation of bad effects that will enable individuals to reproduce later, for example, for the next generation. So it's also part of the process of what I said at the beginning, for example, of vortex of extinction. So preventing inbreeding and measuring inbreeding is also something important to assess also viability of population. So measuring population structure, the fact that individuals are moving towards between population is a good sign of, well, to tell if population are doing well or not. Also, genetic information can tell us the history of the population, so the past population size of one precise locality. That's something we call phylogeography, and that's basically the idea of, in the genetic information of individuals we sample at one time, you also have the signature of the history of its ancestor. So you can also tell basically if at some point in the past, and you can more or less have a datation for that, if the population was supposedly big or did already in the past was very small. So it's also kind of a way for us to understand if, for example, a very small population, is it something recent or is it something that is very usual for this kind of population? Mm-hmm. So I have a lot of information about what they are. So to have a big, to resume a bit, it's how many individuals are reproducing, how they are doing so, and what are the historical and nowadays pressure they have to face. So there is a lot of information we can extract just investigating the DNA. So that's why genetic now is very important part of any conservation study anyway. So also to help us understand the history of other population in the past, part of the project will be to study museum specimen, so extract DNA from specimens that are in conserved in museums. So when we have very precise locality, and we can sample nowadays animals from the same locality, compare the historical specimen to the specimen we gathered on the field, we can have also a better understanding of past population size.
Yeah.
So genetic is useful, but it's not everything. So we have to gather information, environmental data, to help us understand the genetic information. Because without environmental data, well, basically, we're able to see something, but we can't tell why it happens.
Right. Yeah.
So we have to gather, for example, at the landscape level, to have the idea of how urbanized is the area, for example. So is the habitat very fragmented, destructed? Do you have a good habitat connectivity? So, for example, edges are extremely important for amphibians and other animals. Maintaining edges are what they use as corridor to go from population to population. So are they able to move, to disperse? So we have to have landscape information. We will also be gathering water sample, soil samples, to see if there is any contaminants, and this would be very useful clues to understand what's going on with the population again. And with this comes the idea of taking morphological measures. So we'll be measuring some parts of the toad, so the lens, for example, something that we call parotoid glands. So basically, behind the eyes, toads have glands, quite long glands, when they produce their venom. So that's a good measuring the length wide of these glands is a good way to understand if there is in some population in urbanized area, for example, if toads are changing to adapt, or is it an adaptation, is it something else? So that's morphological information as a support of genetic information can help us also have a better understanding and something more precise about the possibility of toads to actually to deal with, to cope with the environment they are in. And when we have all this information, that obviously will take huge amounts of time to gather especially when we are speaking about the entire country, maybe we'll be able to do a bit of modeling. So basically doing a map of epicenters of extinction, where are the population doing well or not, and maybe predict based on what we have as information, predict on the short or long run how it is likely to evolve. So it also have this conservation aspect, again interesting for people who want to actually act after, to see, okay, there is possibilities here that population are doing still okay, so it can be interesting to save this precise population rather than put a lot of efforts in population that are probably in very short term they would go extinct anyway. So that's part of the how we can help for people to later on take conservation measures, really, because scientists sometimes we are very good to point out problems, but we are not as good when it comes to really take measures. So that's a part of we have to act together. So that's also something that is very interesting aspect, I think, in this particular project we have. So yep, basically that's the idea of the project. Obviously, we are still thinking about what can be done or not. A few things will be changing. I think we'll be adapting also the plan we have. But yeah, generally speaking, I think it's something very interesting, not just in a scientific point of view. It's because we are mixing with people of other backgrounds. And all of this makes something very, well, extremely interesting, extremely good, and well, to say that things can hopefully end well for this species, at least in the UK. So that's something that helps us understand people, to make them understand that yes, we are speaking about lions, whales, but on your doorstep, the little species that were, I agree maybe that it's not as attractive as many other species, but that's part of the biodiversity. They have their place in the ecosystems, and removing turns, we don't know what can happen. So yeah, even on your doorstep, biodiversity crisis is not just a word you will be hearing in the media or by politicians. It's something really you can really see it daily.
Yeah, I mean, I guess when someone talks about extinction of species, most people probably automatically think of tigers and pandas and these kind of they get a lot of media attention and things. But yeah, as you say, it's kind of happening all over the place, and smaller species, invertebrates are hugely affected, amphibians, and yes, especially perhaps here in the UK, you might not really expect species in the UK to go extinct because we're not a tropical country that's undergoing this massive deforestations and all those kind of things. But yeah, there is local habitat destruction, there is local extinctions going on, or these species going into decline and things. And yeah, I think making people more aware of that is a very important aspect of that. And the projects that you're doing, this conservation projects, and perhaps hoping to come up with some ways of preventing these declines, and at least understanding so we know what kind of measures to take. I think that's a really, really important project.
Well, obviously, as I am in it, I think also, I think so also. Yeah, that's something very interesting in the fact that yes, make people understand it's not just, as you said, it's not just tropical countries. It's happened here, and we actually can at each level do things because we are in the time. Well, unfortunately, we are now in a period where if let's say the citizen, they don't ask, well, governments deciders, they won't make many useful decisions. So that's being, as a citizen, being aware of this issue and willing to make pressure to make things change. That's something very important, very interesting. And as a scientist, we can have this kind of with consultancy role of doing, okay, we can study to make sure that the decision that we'll make will be made after that, well, it will work or not. So that's part of a very, I think, something from the society in a whole, not just a scientific question itself.
Okay. Well, yes, right. That's absolutely fascinating. I really want to sort of thank you very much for taking the time to speak to me and speaking to my viewers. Now, you're not on social media at all, are you? You don't have you've got nothing to kind of promote, so I can't tell people to come and follow you on Twitter or Instagram or anything.
Well, actually, yeah, it's from this project as a student. So I'm part of the University of Wolverhampton. That's something to mention also, and in cooperation with the University of Salford in Manchester and the ARC, so Amphibian and Reptiles group. Trust that. So that's an organization. So I'm part of these three. My Ph.D. is actually founded and supervised by people from these three institutions. So if you people interested will have information, they will have more information searching on the website of these universities, so Wolverhampton, Salford, and also the our trust.
Okay. Yes. So thank you so much for speaking to me. Really do appreciate you taking the time to give us all this fascinating information about the plight of the common toad. And perhaps you say you could be doing this project for 3 years, and will this project be ongoing after that? Is this kind of your PhD period, and then somebody else will take it up and carry on, or do you think it will be kind of finished by that time?
Well, actually, even this project, yes, is just for 3 years, but obviously this main question, this main issue will be asked by the other students later on. They will carry on this research, obviously. So that's something that is hopefully will going on for a few, well, for more years, obviously, yes.
Excellent. Okay. Well, perhaps in a few years' time we can speak to you again and see if you have any results from the project.
Well, no problem with that.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for watching, and I want to extend my thanks to Rémi Martin for talking to me today. And if you are interested in this project and want to find out a bit more about this and other works that the institutions do, follow the links in the description to the universities of Wolverhampton and Salford and the Amphibian and Reptile Conservation Trust, and you can find out a bit more about the work that they do. And if toads are your thing, why not check out an older video of mine that I made a while back about the prehistoric toad Beelzebufo. If you're interested in that, click on the card and you can check that one out. But thank you very much for watching. Hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.